This is the story of how the British Empire deliberately starved 3 million people to death, not because there wasn't enough food, but because feeding Indians was less important than feeding the war machine. The year is 1943, Bengal, British India, the most densely populated province in the world, home to 60 million people, and they are dying by the thousands every day. Bodies line the streets of Calcutta, children with swollen bellies beg for rice, mothers too weak to cry watch their families starve. By the end of the year, 3 million people will be dead, not from bullets, not from bombs, from hunger. But here is what makes this a crime, not a tragedy. There is enough food. Bengal produces enough rice to feed its population. India as a whole has a food surplus. And while millions starve, grain continues to be exported from India to support the British war effort in Europe and the Mediterranean. The British government knows people are dying, they receive reports, they see the numbers, and they decide that feeding Indians is not a priority. By the end of this video, you will understand how colonial economics treats human lives as resources to be extracted, how military logistics prioritize soldiers over civilians, how racist ideology justifies mass death, and how one of history's greatest democracies deliberately engineered a famine that killed more people than the atomic bombs dropped on Japan. India in 1943 is not independent. It is a colony, the jewel of the British Empire. For nearly 2 centuries, Britain has extracted wealth from India through taxation, through forced agricultural production, through complete control of economic policy. This extraction is the foundation of British prosperity. Indian cotton feeds British textile mills. Indian taxes fund British administration. Indian soldiers fight British wars. The empire is built on transferring wealth from colony to metropole. By 1943, India has been producing food surpluses for decades under British agricultural policy. The problem has never been lack of food. The problem is distribution and who gets to eat. Bengal is particularly productive. The rice bowl of India, dense population, fertile land, extensive agriculture. Under normal circumstances, Bengal produces more than enough to feed itself. But 1943 is not normal circumstances. The world is at war, and the British Empire is fighting for survival against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. This changes everything about how resources, including food, are allocated. The British war effort requires massive logistics, feeding armies in North Africa, the Mediterranean, Europe, building stockpiles for potential invasion, supporting Allied forces across multiple theaters. India becomes a strategic resource base, not just soldiers, though India contributes 2.5 million troops to the war, but food, supplies, infrastructure. The colony exists to serve the war machine. The first problem is military procurement. The British government begins purchasing massive quantities of rice from Bengal to feed troops and build military stockpiles. This removes food from civilian markets. Prices spike. Poor people cannot afford rice at inflated rates. The second problem is the denial policy. In 1942, Japan conquers Burma, Bengal's neighbor and major rice supplier. The British, fearing Japanese invasion of Bengal, implement a scorched earth strategy. They destroy boats to prevent Japanese use of waterways. They remove rice stocks from coastal areas to deny them to potential invaders. This destroys Bengal's distribution system. Boats are how rice moves through Bengal's river networks. Without boats, food cannot reach markets. Rice-producing areas cannot send supplies to deficit areas. The distribution system collapses. The third problem is hoarding and speculation. As prices rise and supply fears spread, merchants and wealthy farmers hoard rice, betting prices will go higher. This removes even more food from circulation. The poor, who live day to day, cannot access stored rice. By mid-1943, the famine is visible and undeniable. People are dying in the streets. Reports reach the British government in London. Colonial administrators in India request emergency food shipments. They ask for grain from Australia, from Canada, from anywhere. The requests are denied. The British War Cabinet, led by Winston Churchill, refuses to divert shipping to bring food to Bengal. Ships are needed for military purposes. Feeding soldiers takes priority over feeding civilians. Indian lives are not worth the logistical cost. But here is the truly damning fact. While millions starve in Bengal, India continues to export food. Grain leaves Indian ports bound for British stockpiles in the Mediterranean and Europe. The colony produces a food surplus in 1943. That surplus is exported while Indians die. This is not an accident, this is not an oversight, this is policy. The British government chooses to export food from a starving region because feeding the war effort matters more than feeding colonized people. Churchill's personal role is documented. He refuses repeated requests for food aid. He says the famine is Indians' fault for breeding like rabbits. He asks why, if the famine is so bad, Gandhi hasn't died yet. He prioritizes building food stockpiles in Europe, stockpiles that will never be used because they are excessive, over saving millions of lives. His racism is explicit. He believes Indians are racially inferior. He sees the famine as population control, an attitude that would be called genocidal if applied to Europeans. The economic logic is colonial extraction taken to its extreme. For 2 centuries, British policy has treated India as a resource to exploit. Indian wealth flows to Britain. Indian production serves British needs. Indian lives matter only insofar as they produce value for the empire. The famine is this logic applied under wartime pressure. India exists to support Britain's war. If Indians must die so British soldiers can eat, that is acceptable. The colony is a resource pool and resources are allocated according to imperial priority. The moral framework is racial hierarchy. British lives matter infinitely more than Indian lives. A British soldier's meal is more important than an Indian child's survival. This is not stated explicitly in policy documents, but it is reflected in every decision made. When administrators in India plead for food shipments, they are told shipping is unavailable. But shipping is available for military supplies, for building stockpiles for non-essential goods. The issue is not capacity. The issue is priority, and Indians are low priority. The famine kills through multiple mechanisms. Direct starvation is the most visible. People simply have no food. They waste away until their bodies shut down. This is how most of the 3 million die. But disease kills almost as many. Malnutrition destroys immune systems. Cholera, malaria, smallpox sweep through weakened populations. Famine creates conditions for epidemic. The official death toll of 3 million includes both starvation and disease, but all deaths are famine-caused. Economic collapse compounds the crisis. As people sell everything to buy food at inflated prices, they lose land, tools, animals, the capital needed to produce food next season. The famine creates poverty that persists for years. Survivors are economically destroyed. Social structure breaks down. Families abandon children they cannot feed. People migrate desperately seeking food, spreading disease and overwhelming urban areas. Calcutta's streets fill with rural refugees dying in public. The scale of visible death is unprecedented. The British response is not relief, it is suppression of information. Colonial censorship prevents photographs of the famine from reaching Britain. Reports are downplayed. The British public does not see the mass death their government is permitting. In India itself, some local officials try to help. They open relief kitchens, distribute what food they can access, but without central government support and food shipments, local efforts are overwhelmed. The famine is too large for local charity to address. The turning point comes only in October 1943 when a new viceroy, Lord Wavell, arrives in India. He immediately recognizes the crisis scale and demands action. He forces the British government to acknowledge the famine and begin, finally, sending food aid. But by October 1943, millions are already dead. The aid comes too late for them. The famine's mortality peak is in the second half of 1943. By the time serious relief arrives, the death toll is already catastrophic. Even then, aid is limited. The British government is reluctant. They send some food, but not enough. The famine continues into 1944. Only improved harvests in late 1944 finally end the crisis, not British policy but natural agricultural recovery. The final death toll is estimated at 3 million. Some scholars argue it is higher, perhaps 3.5 to 4 million. Exact numbers are impossible because many deaths went unrecorded, especially in rural areas where entire villages died. To put this in perspective, the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki killed approximately 200,000 people. The Bengal famine killed 15 times more. It is one of the largest losses of civilian life in World War II, and it was entirely preventable. The famine was not caused by natural disaster. Bengal's 1943 harvest was lower than normal but not catastrophically so. There was enough food in India to prevent starvation. The famine was caused by policy choices, military procurement, denial policies, refusal of food aid, continued exports. Every one of these was a decision. Someone chose to prioritize military stockpiles over civilian survival. Someone chose to export grain while people starved. Someone chose that Indian lives did not matter enough to divert ships. The responsibility lies primarily with the British War Cabinet and Winston Churchill. They had the power to send food. They had the shipping capacity. They chose not to. Every day they delayed, thousands died. Churchill is celebrated in Britain as a wartime hero. His leadership during World War II is taught as exemplary. But this same Churchill refused to save 3 million Indians. When told people were dying, he blamed them for their own deaths. His racism was explicit and his cruelty deliberate. This creates a historical problem for Britain. How to celebrate Churchill while acknowledging he presided over mass death? The answer, historically, has been to ignore the Bengal famine. British education rarely teaches it. British public memory does not include it. Only in recent decades has scholarship forced the famine into British historical consciousness. And even now, it remains controversial. Defenders of Churchill minimize his role or claim the deaths were unavoidable. The evidence contradicts this. The Bengal famine reveals the true nature of colonial economics. Colonies exist to serve the metropole. When imperial needs conflict with colonial survival, the colony is sacrificed. This is not an accident of the system, this is the system functioning as designed. For 2 centuries, British rule extracted wealth from India. The famine is extraction taken to its logical extreme, extracting food from a starving population because that food serves imperial purposes. The colony's job is to produce resources. If the colonized die in the process, that is the cost of empire. This logic appears throughout colonial history. The Irish famine of 1845-1852 killed 1 million while Ireland exported food to Britain. Famines in India throughout British rule, 1876-1878, 1896-1897, 1899-1900, killed tens of millions, often while food was exported. The pattern is consistent. Colonial government prioritizes resource extraction over colonized lives. Famine occurs not because of food shortage but because of distribution policy. The colonized are forced to starve while their production feeds the empire. The Bengal famine is the most extreme case because it occurs during wartime with explicit military justification. The British government can claim military necessity, but necessity is a choice about priorities. Feeding soldiers is necessary, feeding Indians is not. This reveals what the empire values. The long-term consequences for Bengal are catastrophic. Beyond the 3 million dead, survivors face economic devastation. Land ownership concentrated further as small farmers sold land to buy food. Poverty deepened. Malnutrition effects persisted for years. The political consequences are profound. The famine destroys remaining Indian support for British rule. If this is how the empire treats Indians during crisis, what value is the empire? The famine accelerates demands for independence. By 1947, Britain will leave India. The famine plays a role in that decision. Modern parallels are uncomfortable but necessary. Colonial extraction, taking resources from poor regions to enrich powerful ones, continues in different forms. Global supply chains extract value from poor countries. Resource extraction benefits foreign corporations while local populations remain poor. Famines still occur, not from absolute food shortage. The world produces enough food to feed everyone, but from distribution and access failures. Poor people cannot afford food even when food exists. Markets fail to deliver food where it is needed. The Somalia famine of 2011, the Yemen crisis ongoing since 2015, food insecurity in South Sudan, these are not natural disasters. They are policy failures, conflict-driven crises, and economic collapses that prevent food distribution. The mechanisms differ from 1943, but the core problem is the same. People die of starvation while food exists elsewhere. The lesson is not just historical. The lesson is ongoing. Economic systems that prioritize profit and power over human survival create conditions for famine. Whether colonial extraction or modern market failures, the result is the same. People die preventably because their survival is not prioritized. The Bengal famine should be taught alongside other mass atrocities of World War II. It killed more people than many events we remember as defining horrors of the war. But it is forgotten or minimized because the victims were colonized and the perpetrators were celebrated. Britain has never apologized for the famine, no reparations have been paid, no official memorial exists. The British government does not teach this history. Churchill remains a national hero. The deaths of 3 million Indians are inconvenient facts, not national shame. This erasure is itself a political choice. Acknowledging the famine requires acknowledging colonial violence. Acknowledging Churchill's role requires complicating his heroic image. Britain prefers to remember its empire as benevolent and its leaders as noble. But history does not allow selective memory. The Bengal famine happened. Britain caused it through policy choices. Churchill refused aid while people died. These are facts, documented and undeniable. The famine proves that democracy does not prevent atrocity when the victims are dehumanized. Britain in 1943 is a democracy for British people. Indians are subjects, not citizens. They have no vote, no representation, no voice in the government that rules them. This creates permission for atrocity. If Indians cannot vote, politicians need not care about their survival. If they cannot hold government accountable, government can ignore their deaths. Democracy without universal inclusion is democracy for some, tyranny for others. The famine also proves that good intentions do not prevent systemic evil. Many British officials genuinely believed they were civilizing India, bringing progress and development. But this belief coexisted with allowing millions to starve. Good intentions mean nothing if actions cause mass death. The economic logic that created the famine, prioritizing resource extraction over human survival, was not uniquely British. It was imperial logic, colonial logic, the logic of systems built on exploitation. Any empire would face similar incentives. The British executed these incentives during the Bengal famine. The final moral lesson is about priority and value. Who gets to live and who gets to die is a political decision disguised as logistics. The British government decided Indian lives were worth less than military stockpiles. This was not necessity, this was choice. Every famine is ultimately about choice. Someone decides who eats and who starves. In 1943, Bengal, Britain decided. They chose soldiers over civilians. They chose military supply over humanitarian relief. They chose empire over humanity. And 3 million people died because of those choices. Not because food did not exist, not because logistics were impossible, but because their lives were not valued enough to matter. The British Empire starved 3 million Indians to feed a war, while grain was exported, while stockpiles were built, while ships carried non-essential goods, people died in the streets. The food existed, the capacity existed, only the will to save lives was absent. This is the horror of the Bengal famine, not that it happened despite British efforts, but that it happened because of British decisions. The empire chose this, and 3 million people paid with their lives. History remembers Churchill as the man who saved Britain. It should also remember him as the man who let 3 million Indians die. Both are true. Both are consequences of the same system, an empire that valued some lives infinitely more than others. The grain that could have saved Bengal fed soldiers and stockpiles instead. The ships that could have brought relief carried other cargo. The decisions that could have prevented the famine prioritized other concerns. Britain starved 3 million Indians not because it had to, but because it could. Because imperial logic made those lives expendable. because racist ideology made their deaths acceptable, because colonial economics made their survival someone else's problem. And that is the lesson. Systems built on exploitation do not suddenly become humanitarian during crisis. They reveal their true priorities. The Bengal Famine revealed what the British Empire valued, and 3 million Indians learned they were not on that list.
We earned this meal, you didn't.